This is the Coast Business Radio Podcast.
The Queensland Chamber of Commerce is the voice of Queensland business with a goal to make Queensland the best place in the world to do business. CCIQ listens to business owners and makes sure governments are held accountable for creating the right conditions for business. Dr. Marcus Smith taught economics and finance at Griffith University. After completing his doctorate, worked as a senior economist for the Queensland Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, lectured at James Cook University before joining the Queensland Chamber of Commerce. Marcus, g'day and welcome.
Good afternoon, Mike.
In the latest World Economic Outlook, the IMF predicts Australia's economy will shrink by 6.7% this year, with unemployment surging to 7.6% and 8.9% in 2021. What's the consensus of COVID-19's impact on world growth, Australian growth, and the financial impact?
Well, I think whether there's ever going to be a consensus among economists, I don't think there is such a thing. But essentially, we all know that it's in bad shape. The international economy is in bad shape. Advanced economies in particular are looking at quite large falls. If you're looking at global growth, cumulative output is expected, as the IMF have predicted, to drop $9 trillion. So that's a million billions. Essentially they've called it the Great Lockdown, and that it's going to shape up for the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. Global growth forecast to fall by -3% over 2020, and to put that in context, that's a 6.3% downgrade since January, so it's moving very quickly. And when you compare that to the GFC, in 2009, we only saw a 0.1%, a contraction in output globally. Australia coming into this, we've obviously thrown the kitchen sink at this. All governments have come on board to provide stimulus measures to try and keep the economy in hibernation and keep businesses, alive over that time. So the success of how we will bounce out of it will come down to obviously the way in which that businesses are able to access this, so the logistics of being able to access all of the loans and payments, and to be able to keep those workers with the JobKeeper package. But essentially that is the risk, as you mentioned, for the financial aspect of it. The GFC was different to this crisis. GFC was a financial crisis where you had a credit squeeze, and then the risk was that it was going to turn into an economic crisis. This is an economic crisis, and it's essentially at risk of turning into a financial crisis, where those markets may certainly turn, start to tighten up. Australia came into this at a relatively very strong position. If you're going to compare us globally with the level of government debt, we've got quite low government debt. We've got high private debt, household private debt, which we'll talk about shortly. But it's only about it's less than 20% at the moment before this in net debt. So that's when you take into account. It's probably upwards of 40% by the end of this in gross debt. But when you take the government's assets, foreign assets into account, it comes down there. So we're well placed to be able to, spend 16.4% of GDP, which takes into account both the government's direct expenditures as well as the facilities given to the RBA to be able to maintain liquidity in the system.
What about the impact on the Queensland budget? Is it like a sledgehammer, or is it like a sledgehammer?
It's a sledgehammer. So to try and gauge how it's going to affect the economy, these things are very difficult. But the way to sort of think about how it's likely to hit is to break down the revenues of the Queensland government. So at the last budget, we we were running at about 60 billion of revenue. So essentially 47% of that comes from GST redistributions from the Commonwealth Grants Commission. So almost half the budget comes in those receipts. Then when you're starting to break down the other components, so, general government revenue with respect to fines, fees, duties, licenses, these things, that's a significant component. So we know that they're probably likely, and gambling taxes, they're likely to suffer quite significantly. For fines, the police aren't out as they usually would be collecting revenue there. Then you're starting to look at payroll tax. Well, we've had payroll tax, and we've had the refunds as well with respect to the current rescue package or the assistance package. So payroll revenues are going to take a hit. Then you're starting to look at royalties, essentially for a coal and LNG and petroleum. So we lifted the petroleum tax rates, but oil's sitting at around about $20 a barrel now. It's so low. So how the impact of that on our revenue is going to be significant.
Well, the impact also on infrastructure projects, for example, off the top of the head here, the M1, all this work that supposedly will go into this. Do you think they've sort of downgraded this from all this work to just maybe painting street signs?
Well, at the moment, I think anything to get activity going. So the good thing is construction has been relatively less affected than other sectors. So construction is mostly going on. But we've been talking about infrastructure and that there is tens of billions up for upcoming infrastructure within the state. So we really need to get this going, and it needs to be productive for us to come out of this. The money needs to be spent well. If we're going to borrow it to spend on infrastructure, it needs to be able to produce significant income in the future. So it needs to be productive. That's the most important thing about when you're undertaking infrastructure.
Is small business and the self-employed bearing the brunt of this economic pause or hibernation, or some say just a catastrophe? Certainly.
Well, Queensland's a small business state, so essentially 97% are small to medium-sized enterprises employing up to 200 people. But if you break that down, half of the businesses in the state, or the 457,000, are sole traders, sole operators. So essentially, that sector will be significantly hit. And if looking at what's happened with the social distancing measures, the movements in trends across retail trading in particular, supermarkets, which are large businesses, have done fairly well out of this. They're employing new people, and the retail sales spend, for February was over 50% of it was in supermarkets and grocery stores. Takeaways sort of had a bounce as well, because a lot of the cafes and restaurants have had to reposition to be able to offer that. But you've got electrical goods, clothing, that they took quite significant hits. Pharmaceuticals, chemists and that did fairly well, but they're always going to stay a pretty staple sort of industry there.
So the economy, do we need to crank it up soon to avoid a real catastrophe instead of just maybe this obliteration that we're experiencing at the moment?
Well, this is the issue, how you can turn it on. It's a very different situation to the GFC. Then we had the luxury where the economy wasn't shut down. So essentially the government could go and, drop money from a helicopter and put money into low-income accounts who have the highest marginal propensity to spend, because you don't give cash payments to millionaires, because if you give them $1,000, they wouldn't even notice it turning up in their bank account. It wouldn't change their consumption patterns. But essentially, we're very restricted now about how we can support consumption, which is the largest component of GDP. So how we're going to the economy is going to bounce out of this. I'm not one of the optimists who think it's going to be a V recovery. I think it's going to be quite a significant lull, because a lot of our trading partners have the other countries which we trade with, and a lot of our tourists come from, that their economies are being crippled also. So I don't think we can get that bounce back in visitors. People aren't just going to start coming back in international tourism. If you're looking at the sectors most affected, it has been in the hospitality. So, tourism in hospitality as well as education. So they've been hit extremely hard.
I think the key ingredient to all those industries doing well is people. You actually need people, and you can't get people in, as you said, if the situation is still grim in other parts of the world, and if we've got our borders up and Virgin goes by the wayside or struggles to keep afloat, it all sort of flows on that the Gold Coast, Brisbane, Queensland itself, which is reliant on air travel, could all, they're going to find it really, really hard in the future. And I don't see any way out for a long time. And I'm not being a pessimist, but I'm just looking at this thing thinking, man, oh man, the whole world has been destroyed.
I think that's exactly what we're staring at. And, that we've been looking for when the next correction, is to occur. But the world's as an economist, we used to talk about the liquidity trap, where essentially you can have, you've got the apparatus to use monetary policy or fiscal policy to either stimulate the economy or draw money out of it and to, contract it to try and wind down inflation. But at the moment, we've got, almost zero interest rates, effectively zero interest rates, and even negative interest rates where banks are charging you to hold their money overseas. So the ability for governments to be able to use interest rate policy, at the moment now, it's just a matter of buying securities out, issuing debt and buying them back, and monetising the debt. So you're just electronically printing money. So we've been in this situation. When is the asset bubble going to collapse? Because consumption hasn't been great. It hasn't grown at the rates it did maybe a decade ago, even before the GFC. A lot of the money has gone into these asset markets. So we've got a significant problem there as well with our housing market being overvalued, and we saw some correction start to come off there. But essentially, if you're looking at the loan portfolio concentrations of Australia's financial sector, Australian banks are very heavily geared in housing. So there's that risk if that market, if that market falters, and turn bad, asset prices fall, and the bank's assets on their balance sheet, the value of those fall. They're going to be under a squeeze to borrow more, to essentially support their equity to stop becoming insolvent.
It's really interesting. We have friends who have a lot of friends that have small businesses, and some have put in have put in for the JobKeeper for their employees, and it's not as easy as it was made out. We were made out to believe it would be. There's all this confusion still. The message is not getting through. And then you have, on the other hand, go and see your local bank, and there's $105 billion available to banks to increase spending and loans and whatever. But the banks themselves are making it very, very hard for the small business or the self-employed. So we have this confusion with, say, JobKeeper or all those things that are put in place to make sure that companies can keep their employees. And then you have the banks doing the same thing, and they're making it really difficult. The gloss that, just from what I'm seeing, the gloss from that the Prime Minister and the government is saying that this is going to do this for you and this will do this for you. In reality, that is not real, because the banks are still as tough as get out of here. And the JobKeeper, this allowance, there's all sorts of curly things in there, and it's just, things seem to be very muddled and very confused, and that alone would add to the despair to small business.
That's certainly right, and you've hit a key point there, because that's what businesses are going through at the moment. And my partner has a business that was shut down, and this is what we're trying to navigate at the moment. Because, as you said, the packages and they sound great, on the face of it, but when you start to getting into the logistics of accessing these assistance packages and these loans and the JobKeeper, there's a couple of things there. Businesses need to have their finances up to date. So essentially, they've had to scramble because they had to have them, to get the jobs JobKeeper, they had to pay them over, and this will be another thing. They essentially have to have the cash flows existing, make the payments over April. So if it's a fortnightly payment, 2 payments to your employees of the $1,500, and then essentially you'll get the money, given back to you, refunded in May. But small businesses don't have that money lying around.
They don't.
And as you said, it's when we've gone to the bank, only last week, we asked the bank, is there a facility? Have you been thinking, can we get some sort of a line of credit or something for this? And they hadn't even considered it, and then the ABA came out and said, oh, yes, this will be part of it. The banks will try and provide some facility over that period so that businesses can make those payments to their staff. Having to go out and spend a couple of $1,000s to have your accounts up to date, which aren't due for a couple of months anyway. All of this together, it's just a scramble, as you said, and businesses who are already in shock, especially the ones that have been completely closed. It's very difficult, and there's a lot of distress out there for business owners.
And it's interesting that the media, for some reason, they seem to just not talk about that. But here's the thing: if you are putting in for some sort of help from the government or from the bank or with JobKeeper, and the government turns off your business, just turns it off in one day, and then says, you can put your hand up and we'll do this for you. You go through all the red tape, and it says, what are your figures from the last 3 months? And let's face it, you have no business for the next 3 months. So why would that be a consideration? Josh Frydenberg said, we're going to avoid all this red tape. And then you talk to the ministers and stuff, and they go, oh, really? So the confusion or the message that's getting out, it sounds all beautiful, nirvana, but it's not. It's actually really, really, really hard. And I don't know, for all the money in China, well, let's pick another country, but why they're not focusing on the irregularities of the truth.
Yeah, certainly. I think the red tape issue is a big one, and that's always going to come back. And the government have been looking at ways in which we can, strain and unshackle the economy from having it's too constrained. The bureaucracies are too large and too complex. It's just very difficult to do business in general, to hire people with all the different awards and the employment regulations and et cetera. It's very hard to navigate, and then you're dealing with all the requirements, through licenses and what you can and can't do it at both a local and state government, and then you've got the federal matters. We're just so overgoverned, and this really is exposing how difficult it is to do business.
Okay, imagine this, Dr. Marcus Smith, the Wizard of Oz, and you have in front this little crystal ball with smoke around it. You've got a pointy hat on. And you are looking to the future using your experience and your education and your magic powers of being the Wizard of Oz. Where do you see Australia being, Queensland being, and Australia being, let's say 12 months?
I don't think we'll have fully recovered. I try and stay away from the crystal balling, and you can see how difficult it is to try and estimate some of these variables because there's just so many moving parts. Australia is an open economy, so it's very dependent on what happens internationally. So how that turns out, I am hoping that it doesn't turn into a financial crisis, and I'm hoping that there aren't, that correction to the housing isn't abrupt, that the housing prices, the market starts to taper down, and we start to see a return to normal asset values, because this will certainly flush out, a lot of the weaker businesses that were just holding on as it was. And let's face it, business conditions in Queensland for the last 6 months have been at their lowest level on record, and that's below the GFC. So businesses have been doing it tough for a very long time. How they're going to bounce back out of this, whether they're actually, some of them would even bother to open up again, that will be the challenge, where we're going to be in 12 months. But you do give credit. I know there's problems with the logistics of what's going on with the glossy. As you've mentioned, the packages that sound, they're aimed well, they're targeted well, they're well intentioned, but how that hit the ground, I think will determine how we're going to come out of it in the end. But it will, as I said, it's not going. I don't think it's going to be a V correction. I don't think things are just going to bottom out and then come straight back up. I think it's more towards either an L or a U. Eventually, it'll be a U, but how long that's going to take, is anyone's guess.
Dr. Marcus Smith, the Chief Economist for the Queensland Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.